Okay, now we're going to be talking about the causal factors and viewpoints in abnormal psychology. So we start off with the etiology. Where do these disorders come from? And we have three terms here where there's a necessary cause, a sufficient cause, and a contributory cause. So let's start with necessary. What this means is that a characteristic must exist for a disorder to occur. An example here would be like the general paresis that we see in regard to syphilis. Those individuals suffering from general paresis must have contacted the syphilis virus. Okay, so syphilis is necessary for that disorder. When we're talking about sufficient cause, a condition that guarantees the occurrence of a disorder. So the example might be here is hopelessness. If hopelessness exists over a period of time, then depression will occur. So hopelessness is sufficient to cause depression. And then you have contributory, and these are going to be a contributory cause is one that increases the probability of a disorder developing. So the example that I can give you here would be parental rejection, and how parental rejection could be a contributory cause for the person's later difficulties in social situations or relationships or something like that. So the way in which they were raised, their parental experiences contributed to their actions today. Right? Also, it is important to distinguish between distal and proximal causal factors. Okay, and what we're looking at here is causal factors occurring relatively early in life may not show their effects for many years, and so these would be considered distal risk factors. So things that happened in early childhood that then don't affect the individual. So again, a perfect example would be that parenting style. Okay? Whereas a proximal, sometimes a proximal factor may be a condition that proves too much for a child or adult and triggers the onset of a disorder. A crushing disappointment at school or work, or severe difficulties with a school friend or marital partner are examples of more proximal factors that could lead to depression. But you see how these are occurring at the time in which the disorder begins. So it's proximal, or in this case it says immediate. And then there's reinforcing contributor cause, behavior that is already occurring. An example of this could be extra attention, sympathy, and relief from unwanted responsibility that may come when a person is ill. Okay. So in that case, that would be a benefit that would help one with their resiliency if they had a caregiver, or they had support, emotional support, psychological support from somebody. But then the opposite would be true. If they did not have any of those support mechanisms, then the lack of could be a contributory effect or cause for depression. Okay. It says, in the study of abnormal psychology, why can it be difficult to specify which conditions are causes and which are effects? I just put this in there, kind of a little think item. You can look on page 63. There's a scenario there. You can read through that and kind of dig a little deeper into the topic matter there. This is not going to be the e-lecture topic item. It's just a little something that I wanted you to read on your own. Okay, now we're going to talk about the diathesis stress model. If you look at these two figures here, the one on top is A, and this is the interactive model of diathesis stress interaction. So your x-axis goes from low to high stress. The y-axis is probability of depression. So in this, if there is a high level of diathesis, then we're seeing that as the stress increases, the probability of depression will also increase if there was a high level of diathesis. If there's a medium level of diathesis with the same amount of high stress, the probability of depression is about 50%. And then again, with the same level of high level of stress, the probability of depression is very, very low or nothing if there is no diathesis. Okay, so remember, the diathesis is the vulnerability. If somebody is vulnerable for a disorder, and then the stress is those stressors that happen that cause somebody to feel like they're being depressed. So the idea here is, between the diathesis stress model, is that we see individuals who have a very high vulnerability for, let's say, depression, but they don't become depressed, and it might be because they don't have these triggers or these high levels of stress. We also see people that have very low levels of vulnerability or diathesis, but high levels of stress, and they also become depressed. So there is the mixture of these two things, and that's why they're putting them together in this model. Now, B is the additive model. And what this says, again, it's still stress and depression, okay? But what it's saying here is that as the level of stress increases, even with no diathesis, the probability of depression goes up. Okay, and so this makes sense to us, that there is a combination, a definite combination between the two for this model. Also, we see protective factors. These are influences that modify the person's response. So again, we have a very high level of stress in the individual. We have a very high level of vulnerability, but they don't become clinically depressed. Maybe they have these protective factors. Maybe they have a lot of resilience, right? Or the ability to successfully adapt to very difficult circumstances. And we probably all know somebody who's like this. So now for the e-lecture topic item, I want you to explain the model. So even though I did explain it quite a bit there, I want you to go back. I want you to define what diathesis is, what stress is, explain the model and discuss what you believe is more important, the stress or the diathesis, and then identify ways in which a diathesis and stress may combine to produce a disorder. All right, and remember, again, this is going to be worth your 20 points for the e-lecture topic item. There's only one of them per chapter, and so I want a detailed explanation, at least a couple paragraphs to go over that. Okay. All right, let's look at another viewpoint, the biopsychosocial. There's 4 categories here. On the left, you're looking at genetic vulnerabilities, again, that diathesis, almost always polygenic. What that means is that it involves many different genes, not one single gene. Brain dysfunction and neuroplasticity, neurotransmitter and hormonal abnormalities, and then temperament. So if we look at the biology, the bio, we look at the psychology, the psycho, and we look at the social, okay? We're mixing those all together. Just like we combined diathesis and stress, now we're combining the biological, the psychological, and the sociological together into another model to identify, what is really the cause or the etiology of these disorders. If we look in a little bit more detail with the neurotransmitters involved, definitely neurotransmitters can cause a result or result in abnormal behavior. It can be because of too much of a neurotransmitter, the overproduction. It can be because it's being deactivated by enzymes or something else. So then there's an abnormally low amount of neurotransmitter, or it can be abnormally sensitive or insensitive. Okay. The 5 most studied are going to be your norepinephrine, your dopamine, your serotonin, your glutamate, and then your GABA. Okay, the gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA. GABA, glutamate, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. Just to give you this little background here. Okay, glutamate is going to be um, uh, uh, the most prolific agonistic or excitatory neurotransmitter. Glutamate is the excitatory neurotransmitter. GABA is the inhibitory neurotransmitter. So even though we have norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin happening at the same time, what they do is they influence glutamate and they influence GABA. Okay, just to let you know that. And we'll hit upon all of these in subsequent chapters. The hormonal imbalances. Okay. So you have the corticotropin releasing hormone travels from the hypothalamus, which is in the midbrain, okay, to the pituitary gland. Then the pituitary releases the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which stimulates the adrenal gland to produce epinephrine and cortisol. And then cortisol provides the negative feedback to the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Cortisol, just to put this all into perspective here, the cortisol is the bad one there. If we're in a situation where we need to really jump to action, then cortisol is good. It provides us that, it helps us metabolize glucose and get us activated and that kind of thing. And so in the short run, it's very good. But if in the long run or long-term stress, the cortisol levels remain high, and then that becomes very, very negative for us. So it's really about the corticotropin or the cortisol that you want to focus on. And then lastly, the temperament, child's reactivity and characteristic ways of self-regulation, and then early temperament is the basis from which personality develops. If anybody who has more than one child, you will know that the temperaments of your children are very, very different. Okay, 5 dimensions: fearfulness, irritability and frustration, positive affect, activity level, and then attentional persistence. And again, you can see these things in your children. Some of them just get frustrated very, very easily, and then others, they will just focus on it, put all their attention on something until they can get it right. It's just the way that they are wired, different temperament styles. Okay, now let's go through some perspectives here on mental disorders. Maybe the mental disorders are due to this interaction of the id, the ego, and the superego. That's definitely what Freud would theorize, right? And primarily what he was saying is that was this fight between the id and the superego. Okay? The ego often deals with neurotic or moral anxiety by resorting to ego defense mechanisms. So you have the ego that's in the middle. It's trying to mediate the immediate needs of the id and the highly morale, values of the superego, and it does this through these defense mechanisms. I've listed these here for you. You have displacement, fixation, rationalization. This is one that that is very easy to identify with. If you purchase something and it's not the best product, but you paid a lot for it, maybe you will rationalize why you paid so much for it. So you won't think of it as negative of a manner because you paid a lot for it. You're having to rationalize your decision there. Repression, put it out. If something is really, really bothering you, then you just put it out of your consciousness. Okay, so these are the ego defense mechanisms that Freud would say people are always looking for. Hold on one second. Okay. Also, Freud would focus on the psychosexual stages. You had the oral stage, anal stage, phallic stage, latency period, and genital stage. So the example that I can give you here would be somebody who is addicted to a particular substance, like smoking or something like that. And Freud would say, well, they were orally fixated. They did not continue through the oral stage and successfully move on to these other psychosexual stages. So they're fixated, they're kind of stuck there, and so that's why it's so meaningful for them to have these cigarettes and smoke. Okay, that's just one example for you on these. Now we look at behavioral perspectives, and then we move on to classical conditioning. Many of you are familiar with the whole Pavlov's dogs and salivation, but you're looking at here, you have a conditioned stimulus, which is the light, orientation response to the light, and then you have an unconditioned stimulus, which is a painful stimulus, which is causing an unconditioned response. So there's no training that is required, there's no conditioning that is required from an unconditioned painful stimulus to an unconditioned pain response. Okay, and so what we're doing here is trying to condition the conditioned stimulus, which is the light, and pair that light with the painful stimulus. Okay, so once you compare light painful stimulus to fear over and over and over, now the light alone, the conditioned stimulus, will also cause fear. Okay, so that's our example of classical conditioning. I guess to give you an example also on that is going back to the classical conditioning would be if you, again, if it's an addiction to a particular drug, and that drug causes the feelings of elation, the feelings of reward or whatever, and now the surroundings around that drug can also do the same thing. So what once was just a normal house is now the house in which you get that drug, and you then feel that elation, that reward. So now just walking into that house causes the reward. And that would be classical conditioning. When we look at operant conditioning, now what we're looking at is you operating on the environment. The responses are learned and tend to reoccur if they are reinforced. And here's where we go into a lot more detail on positive, negative reinforcement, positive, negative punishment. If something is taken away, it's negative. If something is given, it's positive. If you do the response and it causes you to want to do it again, that's a reinforcer. If you do the response and it causes you to avoid it, then that's a punishment. There's also observational learning. Okay, learning through observation alone without directly experiencing an unconditioned stimulus. So you can see somebody, you can see that classical conditioning kind of affecting somebody, or better yet, you can see operant conditioning in action with somebody, operating on the environment. A good example is just a vending machine, where you walk up to the vending machine, you put in your money, you have to operate on the environment, you have to push that button, and then you get something back. Okay, if you're standing in line, you didn't do any of the actual actions itself. You just watch somebody do it, and then you do it the same way. That's observational learning. Impact of the behavioral perspective. Maladaptive behavior is a failure to learn necessary adaptive behaviors or the learning of ineffective or maladaptive responses. Okay, so again, this can happen. Observational learning can be a very bad thing, right? Because it's the learning of ineffective or maladaptive responses. Okay, the cognitive behavioral perspective focuses on how thoughts and information processing become distorted, how they lead to maladaptive emotions and behavior. The idea here is that depressed people, they think that people are talking negatively of them, that they can't do anything right, that they're being picked on, that they didn't score as high on the exam because the instructor didn't like them, and then these thoughts just keep ruminating right? And there's distorted views that keep this depression, continuous. Okay. Also, we have schemas here. So the underlying representation of knowledge that guides current processing of information. Sometimes these self schemas can be very negative. Right? Attributional style, characteristic way in which an individual may tend to assign causes to bad or good events. And this comes down to, this certain thing happened, but there was nothing that you could do about it. It was outside of your control. And they don't believe that. They don't believe that it's outside of their control. It happened because it's me, because it always happens to me. This is just, my whole life, this is how it's been. You probably know some people that have made statements like that as well. So cognitive therapy is a way to interpret events and experiences and determine our emotional reactions to them. So oftentimes marriage and family therapists will speak to these individuals and let them know that you're reacting in a very, very negative way, and it actually might not be that circumstance. Okay? In your mind, that's what you think that these people are believing about you, but it's not true. Okay. I really like this cartoon here. It summarizes everything for us and it's very simplistic. This is a person with a drinking problem, as you see that guy down there on the chair and the table. Okay, and according to the psychodynamic view, he's thinking he's reducing intrapsychic conflict and anxiety. And what would we say that conflict was between the id and the superego, right? And so the ego's trying to develop all these defense mechanisms to satisfy this conflict between id and superego. On the behavioral viewpoint, he says he's learned the wrong habits for reducing stress and he has a stressful job. Okay, so maybe that's observational learning, maybe that's operant conditioning, but they're bad habits. And then the cognitive behavioral viewpoint, he's thinking about his problems the wrong way, and he irrationally believes that alcohol will reduce his stress. You see how these are negative thought patterns that keep ruminating and need to be broken in order for him to get better. All right, what about the social perspective? Well, we have lots of attributes here. We have early deprivation or trauma, problems in parenting, marital discord, low SES, unemployment, maladaptive peer relationships, and then prejudice and discrimination. And we'll talk a little bit more about each one of these. So when we're talking about trauma, it could be depriving essential resources, could have been an individual that was actually institutionalized, neglect and abuse at home, separation from parents. You can see how all of these things could be contributory. Remember those terms, also contributory. They might not be the sufficient cause, might not be the necessary cause, but definitely contributory factors. A parent-child relationship is always bidirectional. The behavior of each person affects the behavior of the other. So parents who have various forms of psychopathology tend to have one or more children at heightened risk for a wide range of developmental difficulties. So, being raised by that parent who has depression, being raised by that parent who has severe anxiety, what do we say about observational learning for these kids? They're seeing how that anxiety is manifested. They see how depression is manifested, and they act in the same manner because they don't know anything different. Everybody is pretty familiar, I think, with parenting styles. You have authoritative, where the individuals are warm and they provide control. Authoritarian, they are low on warmth and high on control. Permissive are high on warmth and low on control. And then neglectful are low on warmth and low on control. So what is the result? Well, for authoritative parents, children tend to be friendly and show development of general competencies. For authoritarian, children tend to be conflicted, irritable, and moody. For permissive, children tend to be impulsive and aggressive. And then for neglectful, children tend to be moody and to have low self-esteem and conduct problems. Okay. Marital discord. Being in that household where there's this aggressive behavior, poor quality relationships, that's definitely going to have an effect on the children, the way they interact with their friends and have relationships. And then divorce itself, the insecurity, the rejection, and can lead to lower educational attainment in kids. All right. What about peer relationships? Well, peer exclusion, that's not going to be a good thing. Always being that outsider, always being picked last for a team. There's cyberbullying here that comes into play. There's also proactive and reactive aggression in bullying. Also, sources of popularity, those individuals that are very, very social and they're very, very popular. Okay, that can be a positive, but it also can be a negative. So, and then those who are not popular, or maybe they are popular, but they tend to become antisocial because it's just too much. They've had too much popularity, and they really can't control the way that people are reacting to them. And then sources of rejection, too aggressive, too withdrawn, okay, can definitely affect the way that these individuals have relationships in the future. Okay. Prevalence of certain mental disorders may be related to prejudice against minority groups and women, and also perceived discrimination and self-esteem. Okay. So we see this, and we'll be talking more about these in subsequent chapters also when we focus specifically on, like anxiety or addiction and so on, and how it might be affecting minority groups differently, how it might be affecting genders differently. Okay. And then the cultural perspective. Ideas about normal and abnormal differ in different places around the world, and individual personality development reflects the larger society. We'll see this in a little bit more detail with this slide here. Oftentimes, if we look at under control behavior, things like aggression, disobedience, disrespect, some cultures tolerate that, some cultures just do not. The example here is that less tolerated by cultures like in Thailand. Okay, to some respect, in the United States, you see this a lot in parents where there's a lot of disrespect from the kids, and that would not be tolerated in some other cultures. And then over-controlled behavior. So like shyness, anxiety, depression, these things are less tolerated by some cultures in the U.S. But the idea of being individualistic, right, is not shared by a lot of cultures. You don't stick out as much when you in some of these other cultures. The idea is to being a contributor to the family, right, not a contributor to yourself, kind of perspective. And then the last slide here is unresolved issues. None of the current theories address the whole spectrum of abnormality. We start off with this in chapter 1. What is abnormal behavior? We said it was not one thing. Definitely, people believe that there's an eclectic approach. You might be a psychoanalytic therapist, but we know that there are cognitive perspectives, behavioral perspectives, cultural perspectives, and so it needs to be eclectic. It needs to be a mixture of all these different things before we can truly understand abnormality or these mental disorders. And the biopsychosocial perspective is currently probably our best approach because it is attempting to bring in the biological components, the psychological components, and the sociological components so that we can better understand mental disorders. Okay, and that's it for this chapter. Thank you.